On the morning of July 31st, 2022, the residents of Strongsville, Ohio woke up to the kind of news that stops a community cold. A car had slammed into the side of a brick building at 100 miles per hour. Two young men were dead. The driver, a 17-year-old girl named Mackenzie Sharilla, had survived. The initial reaction was what you would expect: grief, shock, the particular sadness that settles over a place when young lives are cut short without warning. People lit candles. They left flowers. They called it a tragedy. And for a brief moment, that is exactly what it appeared to be. A terrible accident. A young driver. A car moving too fast. The kind of thing that happens that should not happen, but does. Then the investigators looked at the data. They pulled the vehicle's electronic records, the precise second-by-second information that modern cars store about speed, steering, braking, and acceleration. And what those records showed was not the picture of a panicked teenager who lost control of the wheel. They showed a car that had been deliberately accelerated to 100 miles per hour. That had made no attempt to brake. That had been steered, pointed, directly at a solid brick wall. And inside that car, asleep in the back seats, were two young men who had no idea what was about to happen to them. 20-year-old Dominic Russo was Mackenzie's boyfriend. 19-year-old Davion Flanagan was his closest friend. They had both trusted her completely. They had both closed their eyes and let her drive. Neither of them ever opened their eyes again. What came next? The investigation, the trial, the verdict, and the deeply uncomfortable questions about what had been happening inside this teenage relationship long before the crash became one of the most shocking true crime cases in recent American history. And with a Netflix documentary dropping this week, the world is paying attention all over again. This is the full story, and nothing about it is straightforward. To understand the morning of July 31st, 2022, you first have to understand what was happening in the weeks and months before it. Mackenzie Sharilla and Dominic Russo had been together for roughly a year. By most external appearances, it looked like a typical teenage relationship. Two young people spending time together, attending parties, moving through the ordinary rhythms of adolescent life in a suburb of Cleveland. Dominic was 20 years old, described by friends and family as warm, loyal, and deeply attached to his circle of people. Davion Flanagan, his best friend since childhood, was 19, the kind of person who showed up for everyone around him, who made the people he loved feel seen and valued. But beneath the surface, the relationship between Mackenzie and Dominic had been turbulent in ways that those closest to both of them were beginning to notice. Evidence presented at trial and in subsequent reporting painted a picture of a relationship marked by jealousy, controlling behavior, and emotional volatility. Text messages retrieved by investigators from Mackenzie's devices contained conversations where she had expressed, in direct terms, a desire to control where Dominic went, who he spent time with, and what his future looked like. There were exchanges in which she had made statements that, in the context of what happened on July 31st, took on a chilling new meaning. Prosecutors argued at trial that Mackenzie had become consumed by the fear that Dominic was going to leave her, that she had convinced herself, in whatever psychological space she was occupying in the weeks leading up to the crash, that if she could not have him, then nobody could. On the night of July 30th, the three of them, Mackenzie, Dominic, and Davion, had attended a high school graduation party together. There was alcohol at the gathering. There were also drugs. When investigators later examined the scene of the crash, they found marijuana and what was believed to be psilocybin mushrooms, magic mushrooms, in the wreckage of the car. At some point in the early hours of July 31st, the party wound down. Dominic and Davion, tired, settled into the back seats of Mackenzie's car. She was driving them home. They fell asleep. What happened in the minutes that followed, what was in Mackenzie Sharilla's mind as she sat behind that wheel, as the speedometer climbed, as the wall came into view, is something only she fully knows. And in the years of legal proceedings that followed, she offered an account of those moments that directly contradicted everything the car's own data said happened. To understand the morning of July 31st, 2022, you first have to understand what was happening in the weeks and months before it. Mackenzie Sharilla and Dominic Russo had been together for roughly a year. By most external appearances, it looked like a typical teenage relationship. Two young people spending time together, attending parties, moving through the ordinary rhythms of adolescent life in a suburb of Cleveland. Dominic was 20 years old, described by friends and family as warm, loyal, and deeply attached to his circle of people. Davion Flanagan, his best friend since childhood, was 19, the kind of person who showed up for everyone around him, who made the people he loved feel seen and valued. But beneath the surface, the relationship between Mackenzie and Dominic had been turbulent in ways that those closest to both of them were beginning to notice. Evidence presented at trial and in subsequent reporting painted a picture of a relationship marked by jealousy, controlling behavior, and emotional volatility. Text messages retrieved by investigators from Mackenzie's devices contained conversations where she had expressed, in direct terms, a desire to control where Dominic went, who he spent time with, and what his future looked like. There were exchanges in which she had made statements that, in the context of what happened on July 31st, took on a chilling new meaning. Prosecutors argued at trial that Mackenzie had become consumed by the fear that Dominic was going to leave her, that she had convinced herself, in whatever psychological space she was occupying in the weeks leading up to the crash, that if she could not have him, then nobody could. On the night of July 30th, the three of them, Mackenzie, Dominic, and Davion, had attended a high school graduation party together. There was alcohol at the gathering. There were also drugs. When investigators later examined the scene of the crash, they found marijuana and what was believed to be psilocybin mushrooms, magic mushrooms, in the wreckage of the car. At some point in the early hours of July 31st, the party wound down. Dominic and Davion, tired, settled into the back seats of Mackenzie's car. She was driving them home. They fell asleep. What happened in the minutes that followed, what was in Mackenzie Sharilla's mind as she sat behind that wheel, as the speedometer climbed, as the wall came into view, is something only she fully knows. And in the years of legal proceedings that followed, she offered an account of those moments that directly contradicted everything the car's own data said happened. When investigators arrived at the scene on the morning of July 31st, the immediate priority was the people involved. Dominic Russo and Davion Flanagan were both pronounced dead at the scene. Mackenzie Sharilla was alive. She had sustained injuries consistent with a high-speed impact, but she had survived. The building she had driven into was a commercial property in Strongsville. The damage to the structure was severe. The damage to the car was catastrophic. And the physical evidence at the scene immediately prompted questions that a straightforward accident explanation could not easily answer. There were no skid marks. In almost every genuine accident involving a vehicle traveling at high speed toward a stationary object, the driver's instinct, even an impaired driver, even someone who has lost control, produces some attempt at braking, some last-second response. Tires leave marks. The car slows, even fractionally, before impact. It is a physiological reflex that is extraordinarily difficult to suppress entirely. There were none here. The car had hit that wall at full, undiminished speed. No deceleration. No swerving. No sign of any attempt to avoid what was coming. Investigators requested the vehicle's event data recorder, the black box equivalent that most modern cars carry, which captures precise mechanical data in the seconds before and during a collision. What that recorder showed was unambiguous. In the final seconds before impact, the accelerator had been fully depressed. The car had been at 100 miles per hour and climbing. There was no braking input at any point. The steering had remained consistent, not the erratic, lurching movement of a driver who had blacked out or lost control, but the steady input of someone who knew where they were going. The Strongsville Police Department referred the case to prosecutors. Mackenzie Sharilla was arrested and charged with murder. Her initial account of that night was that she did not remember what had happened, that she may have blacked out, that the crash had been an accident, a terrible, tragic accident that she had no intention of causing and no memory of creating. Her mother appeared publicly in the immediate aftermath and suggested that Mackenzie may have experienced a medical episode, that she had been feeling dizzy in the period before the crash. Investigators tested that account against the evidence. It did not hold. A medical dizziness episode does not produce consistent, deliberate acceleration to 100 miles per hour with no braking response. A blackout does not produce sustained steering control. The data from the vehicle was not the data of an unconscious driver. It was the data of a driver making active, sustained, purposeful choices. And behind those choices, investigators would argue, was a motive that had been building for weeks. The trial of Mackenzie Sharilla opened in August 2023. She was tried as an adult despite being 17 at the time of the crash, a decision made because of the severity of the charges and the deliberate nature of the act as alleged by prosecutors. She faced 4 counts of murder, 4 counts of felonious assault, and 2 counts of aggravated vehicular homicide. The combined charges represented one of the most serious criminal cases against a teenager in Ohio's recent legal history. The prosecution built their case around 3 interlocking pillars. The first was the physical evidence. The black box data, the absence of skid marks, the trajectory of the vehicle, the speed at impact, all of it pointing consistently toward intentional action rather than accident or medical episode. The second was the digital evidence. Text messages, social media communications, and other electronic records retrieved from Mackenzie's devices that prosecutors said demonstrated a pattern of possessive, controlling, and increasingly alarming behavior toward Dominic in the weeks before his death. Communications in which she had made statements about not wanting him to leave. Communications that, read in the context of what happened on that morning, prosecutors argued revealed the emotional state of a person who had decided that ending Dominic's life was preferable to losing him. The third was the absence of any credible alternative explanation. The defense's medical episode theory had been examined and found to be inconsistent with the vehicle data. The suggestion that the crash was an accident could not account for the sustained deliberate acceleration. There was no mechanical failure. There was no external factor. The only explanation that fit all of the evidence was the one the prosecution had put forward. Mackenzie Sharilla did not testify in her own defense. The verdict came back on August 14, 2023. Guilty on all counts, all 12 felony charges, every single one. The judge, Adolfo Tosti, sentenced her to life in prison with a possibility of parole after 15 years. And in doing so, he said something that was replayed and shared across the country in the hours and days that followed. He called her hell on wheels. It was a phrase that cut through the legal formality of the proceeding and landed with a directness that resonated with millions of people following the case. And it became, from that moment, the phrase most associated with Mackenzie Sharilla in the public consciousness. But here is where the story takes a turn that most coverage of this case is not properly examined. Because the families of the 2 young men who were killed, the people who had the most right to speak about what justice looked like in this case, were not unified in how they felt about the sentence. And what Dominic's father said publicly in the aftermath of the verdict added a layer of complexity to this story that is genuinely difficult to sit with. When a guilty verdict is returned in a murder case, the expectation, particularly in a case that attracted as much public anger as this one, is that the victims' families will feel a measure of relief. That justice, however imperfect, has been delivered. But in the Sharilla case, the response from the families was more complicated than that. Dominic Russo's father, Gary Russo, spoke publicly after the sentencing. And what he said surprised a great many people who had been following the case. He said he did not want a life sentence for Mackenzie Sharilla. He said he believed she should have the opportunity to be rehabilitated. He said that what had happened was a tragedy for everyone involved, including Mackenzie, and that locking a teenager away without any realistic possibility of freedom did not feel like the right outcome to him, even given what she had done. Gary Russo's position was not shared by everyone connected to the case. Davion Flanagan's parents took a very different view. They described Mackenzie as remorseless. They said she had never apologized to their family. They said their son had been an innocent bystander, that whatever conflict had existed between Mackenzie and Dominic, Davion had nothing to do with it. He had simply been a young man who got into the wrong car on the wrong night and paid for it with his life. His parents said their family would never be whole again. They wanted the maximum possible consequence. The tension between those two responses, one family asking for mercy, another demanding accountability to its fullest extent, reflects something that this case makes unavoidable. The question of what justice actually means when the person who committed a deliberate act of violence was 17 years old. When the evidence is overwhelming, but the person behind the act was still, in the legal and developmental sense, a child. When the relationship at the center of it was volatile and destructive in ways that pointed toward profound psychological instability rather than cold, premeditated calculation. This is not a question with a clean answer. It is the kind of question that courts, families, and society struggle with for good reasons, because there is genuine disagreement about what the right response looks like, and because the evidence in a case like this can be simultaneously unambiguous in its facts and deeply complicated in its human dimensions. What is not complicated is this. Two young men fell asleep in a car and never woke up. Dominic Russo was 20 years old. Davion Flanagan was 19. Their families carry the weight of that morning every single day. The legal proceedings in the Sharilla case did not end with the August 2023 verdict. Mackenzie Sharilla appealed her conviction. In September 2024, the 8th District Court of Appeals in Ohio upheld the guilty verdict, ruling that the evidence presented at trial had been sufficient to support the jury's findings and that there had been no legal error in the proceedings that warranted overturning the outcome. The appeal was dismissed. The conviction stood. In March 2025, a further appeal seeking to have the conviction reviewed on additional grounds was also denied. Every legal avenue explored by the defense had been closed off. Mackenzie Sharilla, now 20 years old, was incarcerated at the Ohio Reformatory for Women. She is serving her sentence. She will be eligible for parole in 15 years. And then, in March 2026, Netflix announced something that reignited public attention on the case at a scale it had not seen since the original verdict. A feature-length documentary titled Crash was announced for release on May 15, 2026, this week, produced by Raw, the same all-three media company behind Netflix's widely watched Don't F*** K with Cats. The documentary promised a deep dive into the volatile relationship at the center of the case, an examination of the shifting narratives surrounding the night of the crash. It was described as an exploration of where a fatal mistake ends and cold-blooded murder begins. The announcement immediately sent search traffic for Mackenzie Sharilla, Dominic Russo, and the Strongsville crash surging across platforms. True crime communities that had followed the case in 2023 re-engaged. People who had never heard of it were encountering it for the first time. And with that renewed attention came renewed debate about the questions the case had always raised. Was this the act of a dangerously controlling teenager who had decided to take two lives rather than face the end of a relationship? Or was there more complexity underneath the surface, a young person in psychological crisis, in a relationship that was damaging for everyone involved, who made a catastrophic decision in a state that no one around her had fully recognized or been equipped to address? The CARS data does not change based on how you feel about those questions. 100 miles per hour. No braking. A wall. Two young men asleep in the back seat. Those facts are fixed. They are not going anywhere. But the human story around them, the relationship, the families, the grief, the disagreement about what justice looks like, is still being processed. By the courts, by the public, and by the people who lost someone they loved on a July morning in Ohio and have been trying to find solid ground ever since. The Mackenzie Sharilla case stays with people in a particular way. Part of it is the age. 17 years old. A car. A choice that took seconds and destroyed lives that had barely begun. Part of it is the contrast. The image of two young men sleeping peacefully in the back seat while the driver makes the decision that ends them. The trust implicit in falling asleep in someone else's car. The complete, total vulnerability of that moment. And part of it is Dominic's father, a man who lost his son to a deliberate act and still found himself saying publicly that he did not want that person locked away for life. That is not a story about weakness or forgiveness or even justice. That is a story about a human being trying to hold two unbearable truths at the same time, that his son is gone and that the person who took him was also, in some meaningful sense, a child. There are no comfortable conclusions here. There are only the facts and the people those facts left behind and the ongoing work of trying to understand something that resists understanding. The Crash premieres on Netflix on May 15, 2026. If you watch it and want to come back and talk about what you found, leave a comment below. And if you want more true crime documentaries that go beyond the headlines and give you the full story, subscribe right now so you never miss what comes next.